Wonderful to see all of you today, and we're going into our second letter from John that we have in the Bible. It's called Second John in the Bible, but it's an amazing little letter, one of the shortest of all the letters in the Bible, and yet it's got this powerful message that's so timely for us. In fact, this morning, the Pattersons, Tom and Jan, sent us a copy of the San Antonio Express News article, and I was just going to read to you the headlines that makes it so appropriate for the day. A quote, a dark winter. San Antonio health experts warn a tough months ahead for coronavirus transmission. But the reason I wanted to bring that is not just to say a negative word, but to remind us of something we all are familiar with. And that is that we live as Christians, we always live in a time where it's easy to get discouraged and to feel like we are about ready to quit. It is the opportunity and the responsibility of every one of us who are followers of our Lord Jesus to be encouragers in a day of discouragement. I don't know of a time in history where there have not been discouragers, people who are bringing gloom, sadness, and harmful thoughts to God's people. And so we are called to be encouragers in every age and every circumstance of discouragement. I was interested that our own Jan Patterson, who I could just let you speak, but I'll spare you of that. The article this morning in the newspaper said, Patterson says it's been difficult to walk the halls of University Hospital where rooms have housed COVID patients of all ages, including some who are quite young. It says over and over again, she's seen the scene that have come to define this public health crisis. A panic written on the faces of patients struggling for breath. Even as they breathe in pure oxygen from high flow masks, the patients pound on their stomachs to relieve pressure on their lungs. Motionless forms of the sickest patients who have had breathing tubes inserted down their throats. Like all healthcare workers, Patterson sees sick patients all the time. But this crisis is harder to swallow. Quote, Jan said, it's just very difficult to see this because it's preventable. You just don't forget what it looks like to see people struggling to breathe. You know, our healthcare workers like Jan and Tom and of course Ruth and these others of ours are part of the team of caregivers. Oftentimes we forget the people who are suffering physically and emotionally. We oftentimes forget the families who are waiting outside struggling, and they get discouraged when they only hear bad news. But then the caretakers are the same way. There's plenty of room for discouragement. In fact, I think probably there's no ailment more common than the ailment of discouragement. You remember this word discourage is simply a combination of dis and courage. To have courage is to have hope. To have courage is to have some sort of ability, a sense of confidence, the sense of I can handle this, the sense of I'm going to be able to overcome this. And discouragement seems to be the opposite. I'm going to pause this morning to tell you, I wrote it here somewhere. It looks like I dropped it. Anyway, there are two books that I wanted to mention to you, those of you who like to read. There's the classic book that I've recommended before. It's probably the most well-known, internationally recognized book on courage. It's called The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich. And it's a kind of a cerebral book. It's written mainly for physicians and caretakers who face difficult times, and especially who face anxiety and face stress that's causing them physical problems. It's a great book. It's not a long book, but The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich. If you want a little lighter weight book, a book by John Wilton, uh, that is a excellent book on it's called Encourage, Overcoming, Overcoming Discouragement. And the title, which is a new book, actually, it's only 1 year old. The title is A Hope and a Future. A Hope and a Future. This fellow, Don Wilton, some of you know him because he's a teacher in the Billy Graham School of Spiritual Growth. And he's also pastor of one of the largest churches in America in Spartanburg, South Carolina. But these two books, one's a little lighter, but it has the same message of how to overcome discouragement. If you want to go into a little more detail on some practical ways of overcoming discouragement. But we're looking at the second letter by John because his letter is about this specific subject. He wrote it as you look in the, if you read the letter, it starts off by saying, I'm writing to the chosen lady and to her children, whom I love in the truth, as does everyone else who knows the truth. He says, I'm writing to the chosen lady and to her children. Over the centuries, people who are literalists have felt that this was some woman who was a spiritual leader in the church in Ephesus, where John pastored for years. But other people think not so literally. They think this was more of a symbolic way of writing about the church itself, because, you know, right after John wrote this letter, he then went on to write his big letter, which was the Revelation. And in it, as you know, he writes all these symbols. And he almost always refers to the church, that is Christian gatherings. He refers to them as a female because the word ecclesia in Greek is a feminine word. And so he talks about the bride, he talks about the church as she and all of that. So it's more than likely that this letter, when John is writing, you remember the situation. It's always important to know the historical context. You remember that John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. He was imprisoned. He would soon be put to death. And John is writing from this prison cell on the Isle of Patmos. And he's writing back to his Christian friends. And he's thinking about his church. You know, he spent probably over 55 years as the senior pastor of the Ephesus church, this major cultural center. And while he was there, he started many churches in that area and sent out people from the church to do these, start these small congregations in homes and in public places. So when he writes to what he calls the chosen lady, most of us believe that means he's talking about symbolically, so that the Romans would not know who he's talking about, to his former church, to all of his friends there in the church in Ephesus. And when he talks about the children, he's talking about all these other churches in the area. And he's basically saying to them, listen, I want to give you a word of encouragement. He goes on to say, as you know, he says, I'm writing you to remind you, dear friends, so that we should love. And remember, this letter is a complement to the first letter John wrote. The difference between the first letter and the second letter is this. In the first letter, John was clarifying the idea of what it means to love and to know. As I have said to you, I think it's quite unfortunate that we don't have most of the translations that we read do not have the freedom to translate these words in a way that the average person knows what it meant in those early days. The word agape here in the Bible, John's using it because he knew that the other people knew that when he talked about to love, that is to agape, it really means to have an unselfish act of kindness, an unselfish act of caring. So he's saying, remember, we are called to have unselfish actions of caring and concern. And so oftentimes that word love, because it's so mixed up today, we don't get what it means. So So the first letter, he tried to define what love is. God is, quote, love. The better way to say it, God is the one who has unselfish acts of kindness and care for his people. That's who God is. And he says, therefore, we should have unselfish, kind, caring acts towards other people and towards those who are in the family. But he also used that word know. And you remember last week we talked about to know was not to understand. He clarified it because he used the Hebrew concept of to know is to have a close relationship. So when he says you need to have unselfish care for one another, you need to have that close relationship with one another like you have with God. When he's saying all of that, he's helping these people who are under great persecution from the Romans, especially at this time with Domitian starting the physical persecution. And so the first letter was basically defining and illustrating the idea of love and knowing. The second letter is to say, you show this kind of love, you show this kind of knowledge, and by doing that, you can overcome all of these deceivers, all of these discouragers, all of these demonizers, these people who are trying to hurt us. So listen to this. The main purpose of this second letter, I wrote it down to say how to deal with deceivers, discouragers, and demonizers. I asked Roger Warner to do a little thinking and to come up with what he thought this whole idea of being a deceiver is, and why is it so harmful? Why is it that Satan is called the great deceiver, that his main business is deceiving? Here's what John says. I say this because many deceivers have gone out into the world. So he said, I'm writing you because you're going to be facing many deceivers. So Roger, talk to us a little about what you think this means and why is it so harmful? We got a audio.
I broke this down this way. I said, well, first of all, how would I define an ideal deceiver? An ideal deceiver. And then I said, okay, now there's a group of people who are ignorant of the word, and I can talk briefly about how they could be deceived. But more importantly, for those of us who are familiar with the word, we've had the word revealed to us by the Holy Spirit, and we have the word to go on. So first of all, the ideal deceiver is first of all someone you admire. Secondly, the ideal deceiver is someone you trust. And then the ideal deceiver is someone, because of your admiration of them and trust in them, you have elevated them to a level above humanity. And remember, Jesus said in John, he says, I do not need the testimony about man because I know what is in man. Okay, so you've got this ideal deceiver. You admire them, you trust them, you've elevated them to a level that they possibly could not sustain in intelligence or in behavior. Now, those who are ignorant, well, I'll only spend a second there. If you're ignorant of the word, well, you are so wide open to deceit, you'll believe anything, because if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, right? So, okay, now put that aside. Now, let's talk about us who are believers, and we're grounded in the word, we're grounded in truth. I think that what I conclude is that the major appeal of a deceiver is that they are giving us permission to do something that our rebellious self already wants to do.
Yes.
I'll give you 3 examples. One is, let's say, humanists have infiltrated many churches, and their focus is on doing good and charity, but they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They don't believe in that doctrine. And so someone who is weak in doctrine but wants to be a charitable giver, they're attracted to that. That's that weakness that gets realized. Secondly, and this is probably in fewer cases, you have some promiscuous desire. And so some deceiver says, oh no, that's okay, you can do that, because what's really important about the faith is this. And then the last example, I think, is just someone who is very uncomfortable with accepting the word that Jesus is the way and the truth and the light, and no one comes to the Father but through him. And so in living in this world where everybody gets a trophy, they just can't quite swallow that, because they would sound like a bigot. And so along comes someone and says, oh, we've got a religion that everybody wins. And so they're deceived in thinking this is my way out. But it's really appealing to their desire to be rebellious. So that's all I came up with, Bill.
That's very good. That's very good. And, this whole idea of being deceived is a form of being discouraged, because whenever our emotions take over, the brains usually go down the toilet. And I think it's important to know that we all are going to have emotional responses to anything, whether it's a person who's misguiding us or to a circumstance like a terrible problem. But to have a guy like Roger Barner, who just a few weeks ago was on machines and trying to overcome a virus and pneumonia and all of that, and then here he is talking about the Lord this morning. I think that's a sign of overcoming the deceiver, overcoming discouragement. And I thank you, Roger, for the words you've given us. That was great. All right, let me move ahead now. With Roger giving us kind of a basis of this whole idea of a deceiver. Listen to the words of John when he says, I say this, that is, he's telling us to be concerned for one another. He's telling us to be close to the Lord. He says, because many deceivers have gone out into the world. They deny that Jesus came in a real body. In other words, he's saying, they're just saying, oh, Jesus and God's just an idea. Jesus and God is just a good thought. He's not a real person. It's not somebody you need to pay much attention to. Does that ring a bell in our day? So he's saying they're out to deceive you, to say, don't pay attention. Jesus is not such a big deal. Then it says, such a person is a deceiver and an antichrist. In other words, he goes on to say, watch out that you do not lose what we have worked so hard to achieve. Be diligent so that you receive your full reward. John is saying something very important to us. He's saying that we need to remember that every one of us are going to be affected by people who are trying to lead us astray, deceivers. We're going to be disrupted by people who are trying to make us feel less than, discouraging, and people who are going to demonize. They're going to try and discredit what we say by saying it doesn't make any sense. But he says, don't forget what we've had all from the beginning. He's talking about from Jesus. Don't forget what Jesus said. So I thought it'd be good for us to hear what Jesus said about how we should deal with discouragers. So I've asked Paula and Tim to read these passages. The Sermon on the Mount, which is just a few verses, Jesus summarized his idea of how to face these discouragers, not only people, but events, politics, friends, family, people who try and drag us down. So let me hear from Paula and Tim. And then the second passage is where, of course, Paul gives us an example of Jesus who faced these very things to tell about his way of handling. So who's going to do the Sermon on the Mount?
I will.
Okay.
Okay. This is from Matthew 5, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, the Beatitudes. Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
If you listen very closely to that, and we'll probably go back and do this Sermon on the Mount again sometime. It's a good thing to go over and over because it was Jesus' most remembered sermon. If you listen to those items that he pushed, listen to this, it's very interesting. If you listen to those items that Jesus ticked off there one at a time, they're very similar to what John is rewording in this little letter of how we as followers of Jesus are to face discouragement and discouragers and deceivers in our day. Okay, now we're going to get an example of not what he says, but of Paul's description of how Jesus handled such discouragement and persecution. Tim?
All right, this is from Philippians 2, verse 1 through 16, imitating Christ's humility. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Do everything without grumbling. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain.
Thank you, Tim. Wow, when you hear those words, they're just, the way they hit me is that Jesus said, here's the way to do it. Then Paul says, here's the way Jesus did it. And it's almost exactly the same list in different words of how to deal with these kind of difficult times, the discouragement and deceivers hitting you all the time. So let me just get real practical now. I'm going to look at the 2 John by getting very practical and saying sometimes we can read like 2 John, we can read the Sermon on the Mount, we can read this great humble servant passage in Philippians and miss the key notes because we just sort of move through it. So I think sometimes it takes, just like God gave the children of Israel, not just give them a little talk, he actually gave them the 10 Commandments because he thought, okay, I'm going to make it real clear. And sometimes don't we understand things better when we're told what not to do? Well, I'm going to tell us what not to do and what to do according to John in this 2 John. And he gives us, I'm going to call it the 7 commandments for dealing with discouragement. Okay? The first one, I'm going to flash this up here once in a while. The first one is, thou shalt not be naive. That's the first one. Notice what he says here in verse 7 and 8. He says, watch out. There are many deceivers in the world. And these deceivers are going to try and discourage you. They're going to try and divert you. They're going to try and get you to go down the wrong path. They're going to try and get you to forget what you're called to be and who you are. They're going to forget where you're trying to get you to forget your source. They're going to try to fix you so you're not fixated on God and on our Lord Jesus. It's the picture of thieves hiding in the bushes, and you're walking down the road not paying attention, and they jump out and grab you. What John is saying is, watch out, always be on the alert that you are living in a tough world. Well, you say, well, Bill, that's pretty obvious. Yes, but let me ask you this, is it obvious to you that you should be experiencing distractors and deceivers and demoralizers? Is it something that you expect? Or are you totally surprised and shocked and saying, oh my gosh, why is this? God, tell me, why is this happening to me? Jesus took Paul and Peter and James up on the mount with him. And you remember what he said? They said, we're just going to stay up here on the mountain with you, and we're not going to get down there where all those nasty people are. And you remember what Jesus said? No, you go back down there in the valley. You're valley people. Listen, friend, we Christians, we gather occasionally to get inspired, but our business is not going to the worship center and getting inspired. Our business is living in the valley. So what do you expect to happen when you're in the valley? What do you expect? Well, you expect to see suffering. You expect to be hurt. You expect your heartstrings to be pulled. You expect tears, and you expect to join in with them. So don't be naive to think there's something wrong with that. That's just the way it is in this sin-ridden world that's fallen. Whether you're like Tom and Jan, and you're walking through those halls and it breaks your heart to see these people on the suffering when it doesn't have to be that way. When you got foolish deceivers saying, oh, things are not that bad. Things are okay. It's going to be fine. And they say, no, it's not. It's horrible. What we need to be able to say as Christians, we're not naive. We know this is the way it is. We know that it's our job to be there among them. Okay, what else? What else does he say here? The second thing he says is, thou shalt not be an overreactor. Thou shalt not overreact. That is, be introspective. That means take a good look at who you are. Don't let somebody else define you. The point here is, here's the way John put it. The truth lives in us. He says, there are going to be people, watch out, there are going to be people who are going to deceive you. There are going to be situations where your emotions are jerked around, but don't follow your emotions, follow the Lord. He said, the truth lives in us. Here's that point that John and Paul and Peter and Jesus tried to remind us. Listen to this, if you get discouraged, if your emotions start messing with you, remember this, don't overreact. Turn inward, turn to where Christ lives in you, and say to yourself, Christ lives in me. I can't change everything. I'm limited, but God is not limited. Give yourself a break. You can't save the whole world. You can't save every patient. You can't save every family member. Some of you right now are facing some difficult times with your family members, with your close friends. Don't we all have people going through horrible things, and you have questions come to your mind, you have pain come to your heart? But won't you say this? I'm not going to overreact. I'm not going to give in to this. I'm going to let my emotions take over. Yeah, sure, I'm going to be real and say I hurt, but that's not going to be all of me. Who I am is I am a person who has Christ living in me. So the third thing he says is this. The third thing John brings out is, thou shalt not go it alone. Don't try to go it alone. It's very, you know what I think most people I've seen who experience the deepest discouragement are people who try to solve it all by themselves, and they become too meditative, too contemplative. People who are able to relate to others and share their feelings, somehow the Lord speaks through others, and somehow there is, in the sharing of suffering, the sharing of the good news, it strengthens us. Here's the way John put it. He said, when you're attacked, we should love. I'm going to put the true translation. When you're attacked, we should care unselfishly for one another. What is that talking about? John and Jesus was talking about this. When you're under attack, don't go it alone. Don't try and solve it on your own. Don't just pray. Jesus said, and John's telling us here, that we need one another. We need the family. We need to share. Your emotions and your discouragement is going to get worse, and it's going to attack your thinking. It's going to attack what you do. If you don't share it, find somebody or some group like we have here where you can share yours and tell your feelings and ask other people to tell about theirs. And when we share it, somehow there's something that the Lord does in us and through us. The next thing he says is, in number 4, he says, thou shalt not get distracted. That means John was telling us, you know, you're going to have these things happen, and you're going to have moments of discouragement. You're going to have these valleys, but remember your main purpose. Why did you get into this? Why are you in the valley? Why are you experiencing things? You know what? If you took the Hindu approach, if you took the Buddhist approach, which is just get in isolation, don't care about anything. Don't care about anything on this earth. Only think of spiritual things. Keep your head in the heavens. If you don't relate to suffering people, you're not going to suffer, are you? But that's not the Christian way. Jesus came to us. He was in heaven, and he came to us to be with us, and he sent us now to be with them. So we are to remember, why are we in this? We're in this to suffer with. We're in this, in other words, to have compassion. So whenever you get discouraged, don't get distracted. Don't forget who you are, why you're in this in the first place. You know why people give up? I found out this as a senior pastor. I found out that most of my friends who quit the ministry, you know why they quit? Because there were so many discouragers and deceivers and bitter people in the church. They weren't discouraged because of the world. They were discouraged because inside Christians didn't act like Christians. They didn't act like Jesus. And they just said, I'm giving up on this whole mess. Why did they really give up? I'll tell you why they really give up. They give up because they forget it was God who called them, not these people. That their calling is not based on what happens. It's based on who they are and what they're doing for the Lord. Why are you in this? The question is that we are to, here's what he says in verse 6. He says, love, that is, caring unselfish of others, means doing what God commanded, keeping on the main path. Why could Jesus keep, let me ask you, why did Jesus, our Lord, keep on moving forward when the very people he was trying to help were against him? It's because he had a purpose, he had a goal, he had a calling. Do you feel like you're here to serve the Lord, or are you here simply to serve people? I'll tell you what, if you're simply here to serve people, when the people don't appreciate you, when you get discouraged, you're going to quit them. But if you're here to serve him, to be one of his caregivers, you'll keep on. The next is, number 5, is Thou shalt not throw a pity party. Thou shalt not throw a pity party. What am I talking about? John put it this way: how happy I was to meet some of your children and to find them living according to the truth. In the midst of all of this suffering, I mean, picture this now. John is on the Isle of Patmos. He's exiled. He's in a prison. He knows he's facing death. And what has he said? He said, you know, some of the translations, he said, I am so filled with joy. What? How in the world was John filled with joy when there's so much discouragement all around him? He was filled with joy. He says, why? Because I met some of your children. I met some of the churches, some of the people who are following the Lord and they're being faithful. Let me ask you something. When you look around, do you see a lot of things to be discouraged about? I hope you do. If you're not, you're something stupid or you're something, you just don't get it. There's a lot to be discouraged about. But here's the question is, what else do you see? Do you look for God's hand in that one person? Do you look for God's spirit touching that one place? If you sit around and throw a pity party because you don't have things the way you want or because things are so bad, you're going to stay discouraged. To overcome discouragement, to be an encourager, is to rejoice, to find reasons to be grateful, to find reasons to be happy in the Lord. And that's what John is telling us. Finding something or someone to rejoice in, someone to laugh with, someone to smile, someone to say good things about. We must mix the sorrow with the joy. And I'll tell you this, if you allow your emotions to say there's only sorrow, you'll only get more discouraged. But if you don't throw a pity party, but you look for some place to have a happy party, you're going to find it. Okay, the last one I want to mention, there's some others, but I'm just going to mention this one. Thou shalt not act like an atheist. You say, well, I'm not an atheist. I believe in God. No, we're not talking about being an atheist. We're talking about acting like an atheist. What is an atheist? An atheist is listen to this. An atheist is a person whose worldview is they only see what's natural. They only see what's physical. They don't see the supernatural. They don't see the eternal. I'm going to ask you this. When you look at situations that are discouraging, what do you see? If you have a Jesus worldview, if you have a spiritual worldview, you look for the hand of God even in the worst situations. You try and see, where is God acting? What is God doing? You ask God to show you himself. You see, to overcome discouragement, we must look at the world through the eyes of Jesus. I want to tell you something. I could let everyone, in fact, we may even have a few of you here in the last few moments share. When you're in a very discouraging situation, haven't some of you looked around to see that sweet nurse? I remember Charlie telling me this week that he met one of the nurses who prayed with him. And he said, right in the middle of all that stuff, here was God providing me with this one godly nurse. And he told me about another nurse who anointed him with oil and prayed with him. Now think about that, right in the middle of this death-threatening disease and all this pain and all this misery, looking for God in the middle of it. Do you have a view of Christ? Now, there are people who can only see the physical. That's why I think a medical doctor, a caring counselor, a teacher, a friend, who looks at the situation and said, yes, I'm going to be realistic about this. I must do all I can and all that science can do. But I'm also going to look to see where is God and pray that God will do something. I love that old saying that when I first heard it, I've never forgot it. William Carey, who went to India, and he made that famous statement when they said, you don't need to go to India. God will take care of that. He said, no, I'm going. He said, you know why? I'm going to pray as if everything's up to God, and I'm going to work as if everything's up to me. That's the balance, isn't it? The balance is, do you look through the eyes and say, I'm going to give every bit of my brains and my ability to get this done? But I'm also going to realize that God is at work here, and I want to see him working in it all. So these are just some things that I think John brings out, and that this whole picture of the way Jesus handled his discouragers. So let me ask you a question. Who here, and maybe one of you who are out there working among people who are hurting, some in the nursing homes, some of you are going to nursing homes, some of you are going to friends, some of you are on the phone talking to people who are going through hard times. What do you think are some things that we can do to be encouragers in such discouraging times? Somebody share with us. Don't forget to turn on your mute.
Bill, this is Chris.
Hey,
Sorry,
good.
this is Chris. I mean, regardless of the specific examples you had, but just being nice to people. Start off just being nice to people that you don't need to be nice to.
Yes. What is that? What do you think that does?
Well, I think that it shows kind of the love of Christ to people, but hopefully it's infectious.
Yes, and I think it is infectious. Who else? Who else? Who's has to face these things? Some of you, maybe some of you folks who are former doctors and nurses and healthcare providers. You're reading all this stuff that I read that Jan mentioned. Some of you healthcare workers, present and past, what did you do to keep from being discouraged when you're immersed in so many discouraging things? Somebody share with us some of the things you do. I mean, there's so many things, but just share us something.
I'll speak up. I want to reinforce what I just heard Chris say, and it resonated so true. It was, again, my lesson from the halls of Charity Hospital during Katrina, when we said we can't control what's happening to us. I mean, we literally could not control the hurricane, the flood, the behavior of people in the streets and so forth. But what we can control is how we treat one another. And so that's exactly what Chris was saying. He said, be nice, but it's about how we treat one another in very, very dire circumstances. And it's very, very simple, but it's so powerful.
So powerful. It's that lesson that we've all resonated with. Viktor Frankl, who was facing the Nazi concentration camp, he said almost the same words that you're saying, Dr. Ruth. He said, you know, I can't control these Holocaust people who are torturing me, but what I can control is how I act to my fellow inmates. And I think that's so, isn't that true of all of us, friends? And what are some things you do, Ruth and others, what are some things you do to keep that attitude as opposed to giving up yourself when there's so much around you? What are some things you do to keep that attitude, Ruth?
Well, I guess going towards someone who needs encouragement. I'll give you a very concrete, recent example. This morning, right before our class started, I was on the phone with our Metropolitan Health Director, Dr. Junda Wu, and talking to her about what Tyler had seen yesterday down on the Riverwalk when he went running, which really alarmed him greatly. And so I called up our dear Metropolitan Health Director, Dr. Junda Wu, who I see as someone who's been somewhat beleaguered, but very diligent, and said, you know, I'm calling not to criticize, but to encourage. And how can I be helpful to you, Junda, in getting the messages out that need to be heard, that aren't being heard right now?
Oh.
So going towards, putting yourself out and going towards someone who needs encouragement where you might be able to be helpful.
Isn't it amazing how when we encourage others, that it encourages us? And I think that is a key element of our Lord, who, when he was in the worst shape, he always turned to someone else and tried to encourage it. There must be a mechanism that God has put into our creative design, that as we give, it comes back. What we give comes back. So thank you, Ruth. Anybody else? What else do you do when you face these things that helps you?
Bill, this is Fred.
Okay, Fred, good.
Chris mentioned a moment ago to be nice to people. Another way I think you can encourage is to listen. And let me give you a very recent example. Yesterday, Chris and I went out to Bandera to assess a ramp for a lady. We were looking for her address, and she called and told us no, she had moved recently to another address. So we go over there, and we're measuring, and I'm looking, and I'm writing down and concentrating. And we get in the car, and Chris says, "You hear her talk about losing her son?" I said, "No." I was too interested in the practicality of measuring for this ramp. And Chris told me that that's why she had to move, because her son died and her sister, who owned the home, had to sell it. And I think the act of listening is just very important, and I'm not very good at it.
Well, I think you are good at it. Occasionally, we all have other things on our mind, but thank you for that reminder. And Fred, this fellow that I mentioned, Don Wilton, who wrote this book, A Hope and a Future, The Overcoming of Discouragement, became a very popular book in America, one of the top sellers on discouragement. He actually spent a lot of his time going to prisons, visiting juveniles. And he told the story of one boy who'd been in there for 17 years and was let go. When he was let go, he went out and he only lasted about a week, and he ended up beating up an elderly woman. And when they asked him why he did that, he said, "I wanted to be arrested so I could get back to my friends and back to a safe place." Isn't it amazing, unless we find a greater purpose in life, that the world is just too much for us? And there are a lot of people where the world is too much, not just in prison, but for some of us, our family, our situation, our world is just too much for us. And when you don't have that greater purpose, it can really be tough. Somebody else, what do you see that helps in overcoming discouragement?
I have one.
Who is this?
I'm Tim.
Oh, hey, Tim.
It's a quote by Mark Twain. Do the right thing. It will gratify some people and astonish the rest.
That was good.
That's good. Thank you, Tim. Who else?
Bill, it's Blanche.
Yes, please.
And I just want to share an experience I had many years ago. It was early on in our journey in South America. I was very young, very naive. But anyway, we were at dinner one evening with colleagues of my husband, and I met this Jewish man who was a Holocaust survivor. Wonderful, wonderful person, very positive, never said anything negative about what happened to him. But the one thing he did say, he said, "Young lady, the way I survived was by learning something new every day that I was in the concentration camp."
Wow.
That has really resonated with me because it wasn't his learning a fact. It was probably his learning something new about a fellow concentration camp person. And so I think about that very often, and I do try to learn something new every day. It could be a new fact. It could be a new flower or a new little tree that I see, but it can also be something new I learn about a person that I didn't know before.
That's wonderful.
That has, like I said, it happened many years ago. We were very young when we went to South America. I was very young. My husband was not naive. He was smart. I wasn't.
But thank you, Blanche. You know, I think this C.S. Lewis used to say, the creativity and the desire for more is a sign of faith.
Yes.
I think that's part of growing, is that faith element in our lives. Who else has some things they've learned about overcoming discouragement?
Bill, I think I've learned so much over these last year and a half with Charlie's cancer. about support and how very, very important that is to help keep your faith up. You
Yes.
know, it might be a card, it might be a call, it might be a text. Just, it's immeasurable when you're going through something difficult.
Yes, thank you so much, Joyce. How, I wonder if we had a show of hands, every single hand in here would testify to the power of the little things.
Mhm.
I can tell you as a
Absolutely.
patient in the last few years, and many of you could say the same thing, as a patient, it was the little things that some people did that are the most memorable. Isn't that amazing? The
Yes.
little things that actually were not so little after all, right? And I think when we do those little things, somehow it comes back to our spirit and keeps us from being overwhelmed by the big things. Who else can say a word of how to be encouraged?
Bill, I'll say a word about that. You asked Dr. Bergeron what she did to encourage people, and now that you mentioned your journey with cancer, I remember very well in great detail the morning of Bill's first biopsy, and the doctor came out and the news was not good. And I, of course, my knees went to jelly and I was very emotional. And Dr. Bergeron took me by both shoulders and looked me straight in the face. She did not give me unrealistic expectations, but her presence. And she said, Phyllis, you will get through this one day at a time. I cannot tell you what truth is in that one day at a
Mhm.
time. I think some of us
Absolutely.
run too far down the road and we buy trouble, we buy worries, rather than experiencing the present. But the other thing I want to say about discouragement is, I know you said don't throw a pity party. Well, I know they don't do much good, but I think we need to caution ourselves. Don't get too tired. When we get too tired and we don't take care of our physical beings, then I think it just opens the door for all kinds of discouragement. So I think one way to encourage each other is when we see somebody who's tired and weary, maybe give a word about resting and taking care of your body that God gave to you.
Good. That's wonderful.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. Anybody else have a word of how you face encouragement? I want to say one thing before we leave, but I want to hear anybody else who has something on your mind, on your heart. Please share it with us. Well, I want to say one last word. Oh, do I hear somebody?
Yeah, Bill, it's Dora.
Oh, good, Dora, please.
I have a couple of things. The first
Good.
time I had cancer, I was not 40 years old. And it was a very shocking event for us as such. But I can remember that a friend sent a plant to the hospital. And one of the interesting things about that plant was there was a bluebird in that plant. And that bluebird helped me so much. I also have to say, I have a coffee cup here. I don't know if you can read it. It says, "Dear God, thank you for friends." Kathy DeBerry gave this to me years ago. And we always drink out of these cups. She gave one to something similar to Joe. And we drink out of these cups on Sunday morning. But this cup hangs up there, so I see it every day. And it's just a blessing about friends, people who are there for you, people who many years ago may have disappeared from your life, but still affect you in many ways.
Yes, thank you so much, Dora. My, thank you. It's not long ago, in fact, it's just last week when a man was telling me that he was so discouraged in all of this coronavirus outbreak that he was just wanting to move to another country. In fact, he's talked about moving to another country. And the more we talked about it, the more I realized that he has focused so much on what's going on bad, and he's very much alone in his daily living. I begin to hear the truth of all these things that the Apostle John is talking about here, and especially this perspective, this perspective of not seeing God in anything, only seeing the natural, the biological. You know, I hope that each one of us, especially those of you who are out there caring for people, your family members and friends in hard spots and those who are facing hard times, to remember this important point. And that is, John tells us here in these last words, he said, grace and mercy and peace will come and will continue to be with us who what? Who live in truth and love. Let me put that in everyday language. You're going to find grace. You're going to find mercy. You're going to find peace in your heart, even when you're in the midst of a pandemic or in the midst of a situation that seems impossible. You're going to find that when you continue to live in truth, that is in who you can count on what you can count on, when what you can count on beyond your own ability, and what you can depend on when you face death, and in love and caring for one another. There's a balance. In other words, he's saying you are going to find grace and peace when you do what? When on the one hand, inside, you don't trust your emotions of the outside, you trust what's lasting, what's eternal. And secondly, when you demonstrate that by showing unselfish love towards others, when you have that combination of the giving and the peace inside, sometimes we have to say that this family member of ours is not going to make it. Sometimes we have to say, I'm going to put him or her in the hands of God. But there's a peace when you put them in the hands of God. There's no peace when you say, I'm going to just keep on, I'm going to keep struggling, and then I'm going to blame myself. One of the hardest things our caregivers are facing, and some of you family members are facing, is to blame yourself that you couldn't solve the situation. But the Bible's telling us, and Jesus told us, to have a godly perspective is to, on the one hand, trust him, put some things, just put them in God's hands, say, I'll do the best I can, but then I'm going to put it in God's hands. And then, but keep on trying the best you can to show the love and compassion and the ability and the skill that you've got. That combination is the honorable combination that John and Jesus gives to us in facing discouragement. Well, I hope something is said here that maybe the Spirit spoke to your mind or your heart. And thank you, all of you who shared. And I'm sure we could talk about this for hours, but we have 1 hour and we've taken it. So have a wonderful week. We love you and great to see all of you. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.